Below is the tightened version based on the full draft you shared. I merged overlapping sections, removed the speaker labels, and used the humorous lines as occasional pressure release valves rather than turning the whole piece into a comedy routine. Out of Scarcity, an edited Socratic dialogue on roads, resilience, economic ambition, and what cities are ultimately for. This dialogue has been reconstructed from an extended public exchange about Yerevan's mobility future. The arguments have been condensed, reorganized, and anonymized. The two voices represent competing approaches rather than individual personalities. Each dash marks a change of speaker. Clear for whom? We often talk about cars blocking other cars. We call it congestion. We discuss traffic flow, signal timing, and intersection capacity. But when cars occupy a pedestrian crossing, people are simply expected to adapt. They wait, squeeze between vehicles, step into traffic, or abandon the crossing altogether. So perhaps the first question is not whether the road is clear, it is clear for whom. But focusing on the blocked crossing risks turning a structural failure into a moral judgment about individual drivers. When thousands of people repeatedly behave in the same way, perhaps the problem is not that thousands of people have suddenly become irresponsible. Perhaps the transport system is producing that behaviour. Drivers enter blocked intersections because signals are poorly coordinated. They compete for limited road space because the network is saturated. They become aggressive because public transport is unreliable and the city offers few realistic alternatives. I agree that repeated behaviour at scale usually points to a system problem, but the system explaining behaviour does not erase its consequences. A driver blocking a crossing still transfers the cost of congestion onto someone with less physical protection. Then enforce the rules. Install cameras. Fine every driver who blocks a crossing. Protect pedestrians immediately instead of waiting years for every intersection to be reconstructed. Enforcement is necessary. But a city cannot police its way to long-term safety while preserving street geometry that repeatedly generates the same conflict. And geometry cannot replace personal responsibility. It should not. Enforcement responds to violations. Design reduces the frequency and severity of those violations. One addresses the immediate behaviour, the other changes the conditions producing it. Pedestrians cannot wait 10 years for every corner to be redesigned, nor should they. Enforce dangerous behaviour now, improve signals now, protect crossings now, but do not mistake the emergency measure for the complete treatment. So enforcement is the tourniquet and engineering is the treatment? Something like that. Although the patient also needs functioning institutions, reliable public transport, and streets that do not continuously reproduce the same injury, then our disagreement may be smaller than it first appeared. Perhaps. We agree on immediate protection. I simply do not believe punishment can permanently compensate for hostile design. And when the proposed solution is to remove the pedestrian crossing rather than accommodate the pedestrian demand, one might recall an old municipal proverb. You can remove the zebra crossing, but you cannot remove the supermarket. People will continue travelling towards their destinations. Removing the formal crossing does not remove the reason for crossing. It merely makes the existing movement less visible to the system. Scarcity or abundance? Your broader model still begins from scarcity. You assume urban space is fixed, so the city must ration it between cars, bicycles and pedestrians. My model begins with a different ambition. Rather than managing scarcity, we should engineer abundance. Yerevan can construct tunnels, flyovers, underground hubs, bypasses, automated parking, and intelligent corridors. We can separate local movement from regional movement. We can use three-dimensional infrastructure instead of endlessly fighting over the same two-dimensional surface. Three-dimensional engineering can solve specific problems, but it does not abolish scarcity. A tunnel must emerge somewhere. A flyover must land somewhere. Every new corridor produces junctions, access points, maintenance costs, and land use consequences. Most importantly, the historic centre remains physically limited. We cannot endlessly widen its streets without removing buildings, trees, pavements, or public space. That is precisely why functions should be separated vertically. Local streets can support neighbourhood life, while strategic movement passes above or below them. In selected locations, that may be justified. The danger begins when grade separation becomes a universal escape from difficult choices. Large infrastructure can move bottlenecks rather than eliminate them. It can also encourage longer journeys and more car-dependent development. So because additional capacity may attract additional traffic, we should refuse to build anything? No. We should distinguish between capacity that solves a clearly defined strategic problem and capacity expansion used as a general theory of urban development. Not every road should become smaller, but not every congestion problem can be solved by making roads larger. Or as another planning proverb puts it, the road to hell is paved with good intentions and occasionally widened to 8 lanes. That is witty, but a developing capital cannot solve congestion with aphorisms. Certainly not. It also cannot solve it by pretending geometry has been defeated every time a ribbon is cut. Velocity or accessibility. A developing capital needs speed. An entrepreneur may need to meet a supplier in Arab Kir, visit a client in Kentron and inspect a site in Shengavit within one afternoon. A contractor may carry equipment across the city. A small business may depend on several deliveries each day. A worker may need to reach opportunities far beyond their immediate neighbourhood. If we reduce network speed, we reduce the number of economic interactions possible in a day. Speed matters. But vehicle speed is not the same as urban productivity. A city becomes productive when workers, customers, suppliers, goods, services and ideas can reach one another reliably. A journey that consistently takes 20 minutes may be more useful than one that sometimes takes 10 and sometimes 50. Reliability still depends on speed. Partly, it also depends on predictability, proximity, network coverage, and the availability of alternatives. A bus carrying 60 people through a constrained corridor may create more access than 60 separate cars, even when each car would be faster under ideal conditions. The question is not only how quickly a vehicle moves, it is how many people and opportunities the network connects. Velocity is a property of vehicles. Accessibility is a property of cities. People do not live according to tidy planning categories. Their schedules are complex. Exactly. That is why they need choices. The objective is not to prescribe one mode for everyone. It is to prevent one mode from consuming so much space that the other choices become unusable. You still seem to prioritize collective efficiency over individual freedom. I define freedom differently. Freedom is not merely the theoretical ability to drive everywhere. It is the practical ability to reach work, education, shops, like healthcare and other people through several dependable options. When driving becomes the only realistic option, it stops being a choice. But who decides which journeys genuinely need a car? A municipal official cannot classify one person's trip as essential and another's as discretionary. A short visit to a cafe may support a small business. A trip to a shop may produce tax revenue. An informal meeting may lead to a contract. The economy is built from millions of decisions that cannot be sorted neatly from above. I am not proposing that the municipality interrogate people about the moral importance of their journeys. People sort their own journeys when meaningful alternatives exist. A tradesperson carrying equipment may drive. Someone travelling alone for 1 kilometre may walk, cycle, or take a frequent bus. A parent with 2 children may choose differently depending on the weather, time, and quality of the route. The state does not need to approve the purpose of each trip. It needs to create a system in which driving is possible without making driving compulsory. But reducing road capacity before creating reliable alternatives simply punishes people. That is a legitimate warning. Reallocation without sequencing can fail. A bus lane without dependable buses creates resentment. A bicycle lane that disappears at every dangerous junction is not a network. Parking restrictions without improved access may hurt businesses. Multimodal planning must be implemented as a connected system, not as scattered fragments. So perhaps the real disagreement is not whether alternatives are desirable, but whether they can be created without first reducing existing road capacity. Sometimes they can. Sometimes space must be reallocated. The answer depends on the corridor. The problem begins when either side treats its preferred intervention as universally correct. Does wealth come first? Wealthy European cities can afford pedestrian districts, extensive public transport, and carefully designed public space because they accumulated capital first. Armenia is still developing. We need economic velocity before we can afford urban refinement. Restricting roads too early may impose the lifestyle of a wealthy city on an economy that has not yet produced wealthy city incomes. But infrastructure is not something we build after development. It actively shapes development. Roads, metro stations, parking policy and public transport determine where businesses locate, how far people travel, what households must spend and what kinds of neighbourhoods emerge. The instruction to grow first and repair later overlooks the fact that the growth model itself becomes embedded in concrete property patterns and household behaviour. Road infrastructure can generate growth. Certainly. So can public transport, reliable freight access, walkable commercial districts, and proximity between housing and employment. The question is not whether infrastructure generates growth. It is, what kind of growth does each infrastructure choice make possible? A system built around compulsory car ownership may expand geographic access for some households while increasing transport costs for everyone else. A highly walkable but poorly connected centre may benefit affluent residents while excluding peripheral districts. Both outcomes can be unjust. Then the objective should be abundance, not restriction. Yes, but abundance should mean an abundance of access and choices, not merely an abundance of lanes. After all, build it and they will come, usually in separate cars. That does not make every road project a mistake. It makes every road project a decision about future demand, future land use and future dependency, not merely a neutral response to current traffic. Yerevan is not Amsterdam. Many mobility ideas imported from Western Europe ignore Yerevan's actual geography. The city is built across hills, terraces and valleys. Summers are extremely hot, winters can be icy. Many residents live far from the centre. Walking and cycling cannot become universal solutions for workers crossing a hill-separated metropolitan area. I agree completely. Yerevan should not copy Amsterdam, Copenhagen or Milan as finished models. The purpose of studying other cities is not to reproduce their surfaces. It is to understand how they diagnose problems, test interventions and build institutional capacity. Yerevan requires differentiated solutions. Steep connections may need high-capacity public transport, cable systems, elevators, tunnels, or strategically designed roads. Flatter districts may support far more walking and cycling than we currently allow. Peripheral neighbourhoods need reliable connections to employment and major transport nodes. Local streets need safe access to schools, shops and services. Then cycling cannot be the organising principle, nor should private driving be the organising principle. The organising principle should be accessibility. Different modes solve different journeys, but the city cannot become a patchwork of disconnected experiments. Correct. They must form a network. A bicycle lane that stops after 300 metres is not useful. A bus lane without priority at junctions is not reliable. A pedestrian route broken by dangerous crossings is not walkable. The lesson is not simply to add modes, it is to connect them. And perhaps to remember that the traffic model worked perfectly, it was the people who proved uncooperative. Planning fails when it treats human behaviour as an inconvenience rather than the subject of the entire exercise. The working city. There is also a class problem in the walkability agenda. A professional living in the centre may enjoy a pleasant pedestrian district, while a worker from Malaysia, Sebastia, Nornork or another peripheral district spends hours travelling. The central resident receives cleaner air and attractive streets. The peripheral worker receives slower access. That is a serious risk. A walkable centre without strong connections to peripheral districts can become an exclusive amenity. But car dependence is not automatically socially just. Cars are expensive to purchase, fuel, maintain, repair and park. Many people cannot drive because of age, disability, health or income. A city where participation requires private car ownership excludes them. Yet a car can expand a workers' labour market. Absolutely. That is one reason cars are valuable. The mistake is turning that value into a universal requirement. A socially just system should allow someone to use a car when it genuinely expands their opportunities, while allowing someone else to participate fully without owning one. So you are not arguing against cars. I am arguing against car dependency. Those are not the same position. Cars can be extremely useful tools. They are simply inefficient crowds. And parking is necessary in many places, but it competes with other uses of public space. You cannot endlessly widen pavements, plant trees, add bus priority, create safer crossings, and preserve unlimited free storage for private vehicles in the same finite corridor. As the saying almost goes, you cannot have your city and park on it too. The resilient capital. Let us move beyond everyday commuting. Yerevan is Armenia's administrative, economic and strategic centre. In an earthquake, security crisis or major disaster, it must move emergency vehicles, rescue equipment, military hardware and supply chains. Bicycles, footpaths and cable systems cannot substitute for heavy logistics. True resilience requires physical road capacity. If 2 lanes are blocked by debris, a wide corridor may still have several lanes available. A narrowed street could become a death trap during an evacuation. Heavy logistics cannot be replaced by bicycles. I do not dispute that. A capital needs strategic corridors, freight access, emergency routes, and sufficient physical capacity for rescue operations. But everyday private car capacity and emergency logistics capacity are not identical. A wide arterial already saturated with private cars may be unusable precisely when emergency vehicles need it. Saturation can be managed through grade separation and intelligent traffic systems. It can be reduced. But no system can guarantee that thousands of people will behave calmly and predictably during a crisis. Resilience, therefore, requires more than the number of asphalt lanes. It requires alternative routes, strong incident management, protected emergency access, reliable mass transport, and local access to essential services. A system in which everyone depends on the same corridors is not redundant simply because those corridors are wide. But only roads can carry heavy rescue equipment, which is precisely why road capacity should not be consumed unnecessarily by journeys that could use other modes. Reliable public transport can leave more space available for ambulances, fire engines, freight, tradespeople and strategic movement. You define resilience as diversity of choices. I define it as physical throughput. A resilient system needs both. It requires enough physical capacity for heavy movement and enough modal diversity to prevent every journey from competing for that capacity. A resilient capital does not place all its mobility eggs in one very congested basket. A charming sentence, but emergencies are not charming. Nor is an 8-lane evacuation route filled with 8 lanes of frightened drivers. Preventing the emergency. Not every emergency can be designed away. Of course not. But safer speeds, clearer junctions and more predictable movement can reduce the number and severity of road crashes. Better local access can shorten emergency response distances. Dedicated public transport can prevent general congestion from consuming every corridor. This same concern arose during a discussion in Amsterdam, specifically in relation to emergency vehicles. The answer was not only to create more room for ambulances and fire engines after an emergency occurred, it was also to design streets that generate fewer emergencies in the first place while keeping essential routes usable. A city must still prepare for catastrophic failure. Yes, but the strongest crisis response is not merely escaping failure faster. It is designing the system so that one failure does not become a citywide catastrophe, or, rather more bluntly, a city designed entirely for emergencies may create one every morning. Energy sovereignty. There is another dimension to resilience. Armenia depends heavily on imported fossil fuels. A transport system in which nearly every journey requires petrol or gas creates economic and strategic vulnerability. Reducing unnecessary fuel consumption is not only an environmental objective, it is also an energy security objective. That argument may become outdated. Electric vehicles can use electricity produced domestically through nuclear power and a growing solar sector. Electrification can reduce fossil fuel dependency without reducing road capacity. Electrification is essential, but it solves a propulsion problem, not a spatial one. An electric car occupies approximately the same road and parking space as a petrol car. It may reduce tailpipe pollution and imported fuel consumption. It does not eliminate congestion or parking demand. An electric traffic jam is still a traffic jam, only quieter. Then electrify the fleet and expand the road network. Electrify the fleet, modernize the grid, improve public transport, and use urban space efficiently. These objectives are compatible. The false choice is believing that support for electric vehicles requires unlimited private car capacity. So energy diversification is not enough, not by itself. A resilient capital needs both energy diversification and mobility diversification. The city is not a pipe. You repeatedly resist the language of throughput, but cities depend on movement. Goods must move, workers must move, capital must circulate. Yes, but a city is not a pipe whose success is measured only by how rapidly objects pass through it. Movement serves interaction. People travel to work, meet, trade, learn, care for others, and participate in public life. The objective is not movement for its own sake, it is access to those activities. Without high-speed movement, the city's economic radius contracts, and without proximity, reliability, and multiple access options, movement becomes longer, more expensive, and more fragile. A highway is optimized for movement, a city is optimized for exchange. Perhaps it must be optimized for both. Yes, but in different places and at different scales. A regional corridor, a neighborhood street, and a historic square should not be designed according to the same objective. The city is not one homogeneous transport surface. It is a collection of places with different functions, vulnerabilities, and forms of value. Two forms of ambition. Then let me state the difference clearly. Your model prioritizes systemic efficiency through structural allocation. Because urban space is finite, you seek to optimize how many people and goods can pass through it. You use public transport, walking, cycling, restrictions, and spatial reallocation to protect the network from excessive private car demand. My model prioritizes systemic resilience through structural capacity. I believe optimization within a saturated two-dimensional network eventually reaches its limits. A rising capital must build multi-level infrastructure, intelligent corridors, and physically separated networks to avoid an artificial economic ceiling. That is a fair distinction. Your model asks how engineering can expand the physical field of movement. Mine asks how the existing field can be used more efficiently, safely, and equitably. No. I fear your approach can become an economy of limitation, and I fear yours can produce expensive infrastructure that locks the city into greater dependency. I see tunnels, flyovers, and strategic corridors as engineered abundance. I see public transport, local accessibility, and modal choice as another form of abundance. Then perhaps the choice is not ambition versus restraint. No, it is between different forms of ambition. The ambition to build more physical capacity where it genuinely creates value, and the ambition to organize finite space so intelligently that the city does not require every person to use the most space-intensive mode for every journey. Then the synthesis would be strategic expansion without universal road expansion, and multimodal planning without universal road reduction, grade separation where evidence supports it, public transport priority where moving more people matters more than moving more vehicles, protected access for logistics, emergency services and tradespeople, safe walking and cycling for journeys that do not require a car, intelligent traffic systems, intelligent land use, electrification, diversification, physical capacity, spatial efficiency. What kind of city becomes possible? We began with a blocked pedestrian crossing and ended with national resilience like economic development and energy sovereignty. Because infrastructure is never neutral. A crossing, a road, a bus lane, a flyover, and a parking policy do more than organise movement. They shape behaviour, land use, economic geography, and public expectations. They influence who can reach opportunity and who carries the costs of the system. Then perhaps the central question is not whether Yerevan should build. It is what Yerevan should build, where and for what purpose. Exactly. Not every corridor requires the same treatment. Not every journey requires the same mode. Not every engineering intervention produces the same kind of city. And no single principle can resolve every urban conflict, which is why the city needs systems thinking rather than slogans, even rather good slogans. Yerevan will need roads, public transport, freight access, safer walking, cycling, electrification, digital systems, and stronger institutions. The real challenge is not choosing between engineering and ecology or between wealth and walkability. It is building a city in which infrastructure expands opportunity without allowing one mode to consume the whole system. then perhaps the final measure of success is not how fast every vehicle can move, but how many people can reach what they need safely, reliably, and with dignity.